Room went quiet the moment my son-in-law put down his fork. Not the polite kind of quiet, the kind that happens when everyone at the table realizes something has just shifted and nobody quite knows what to do about it. 63 people. White tablecloths. A view of the lake through floor-to-ceiling windows that my daughter had spent 4 months obsessing over. And my son-in-law, a 34-year-old man I had genuinely liked until about 40 seconds ago, was standing up with his glass raised. I thought it was going to be a toast. It wasn't a toast. "Before we get to the cake," he said, loud enough that the string quartet near the back actually stopped playing, "I just want to say something about the man sitting at table 7, my father-in-law." He paused and smiled at me. Not a warm smile. The kind of smile you give someone right before you say something you've been holding for a long time. He's been very generous tonight. He really has. But let's be honest. Generosity is a lot easier when you don't have anything better to spend it on. The laughter started slow. Then my daughter laughed. Then my wife. I sat there with a glass of sparkling water in my hand and I thought, $62,430. That's what I had put into this evening. And the only person in this room who knew that number, other than my accountant, was my wife. Let me go back. Because none of this makes sense without the beginning, and the beginning is important. I worked construction for 11 years before I got my contractor's license. Started out swinging a hammer in the summer between my junior and senior year of high school just to help my parents with the mortgage, and something about the work stuck. There's a satisfaction in building things with your hands that I've never been able to fully explain to people who haven't done it. You can drive past something 20 years later and say, "I put that up. I know what's behind those walls. That belongs in some small way to me." By the time I was 42, I had my own company. Not a big operation. 12 employees at the peak, mostly residential work in the suburbs south of Columbus. We did kitchens, additions, the occasional full custom build. I wasn't wealthy by any stretch, but I was comfortable. I owned my house, outright. I had a retirement account that didn't embarrass me. I took a real vacation every couple of years. My wife came into my life when we were both in our mid-40s. She had 2 kids from her first marriage, a son who was 12 and a daughter who was 9. Her ex-husband had moved to Phoenix and called on birthdays when he remembered. She was tired and proud, and she didn't ask me for anything, which was one of the things I loved about her. The kids were another story. Her son adjusted eventually. It took 2 years and a lot of patience. But by the time he was in high school, we had something that felt like a real relationship. We still talk. He came to help me replace my back deck last spring, and we spent 2 days out there in the sun, just working and talking the way men do when there's something to occupy their hands. I'm grateful for that. Her daughter was different from the start. I don't say this to be unkind. I've turned it over in my mind many times, trying to be fair to her. She was 9 when I came into the picture. 9 is old enough to have opinions and young enough to have no filter about expressing them. She looked at me the way some kids look at a substitute teacher, like I was filling a slot, not earning a place. I told myself she'd come around. Kids come around. She did not come around. What she did instead was grow up smart and funny and charming with everyone except me. She called me by my first name for 15 years, which I said was fine and which was not fine. Not really, though I never said that aloud. She would hug my wife in the kitchen and stop at the doorway when I walked in, like there was an invisible line she'd decided not to cross. And my wife, who saw it, told me it just took time, and I believed her because I wanted to. When my daughter, I'll call her that because I don't know what else to call someone I raised for 14 years, got engaged, my wife cried at the dinner table and I opened a bottle of champagne and we toasted to their future. Her fiancé was the son of a dentist from Westerville, the kind of young man who shakes hands with both hands and looks you in the eye and says, "Sir," at the right moments. I thought he was decent. I thought this was going to be good. Then the planning started. The venue my daughter had chosen was a lakeside event space in central Ohio, the kind of place that charges you for the air and calls it an ambiance fee. The initial estimate for a Saturday evening, dinner, open bar, photography, florals, and a band came to just over $48,000. My wife called me into the kitchen one evening, and slid the estimate across the island like she was serving me dinner. "We're going to help them, right?" she said. I looked at the number. I looked at her. "How much are they putting in?" "They're young. They're just getting started." "That's not what I asked." She looked at her hands. "They're thinking they can do maybe 5,000 between them. So the math was going to be, my daughter and her fiancé contribute $5,000, and the rest comes from me." We both understood that. Neither of us said it directly. I said yes. Of course I said yes, because she was the girl I had helped raise, and because I loved my wife, and because I told myself this was the kind of thing fathers do. What followed was not what fathers do in the storybooks. Over the next 8 months, the estimate climbed. The original venue had an issue with the kitchen ventilation that added a rental supplement. My daughter decided she wanted the extended open bar package, which added $400 a head. The florals were redesigned twice. A photo booth was added, a late-night snack station, an upgraded lighting package that the coordinator described as transformative, and that I would describe as several $1,000s of Edison bulbs. Every time the number went up, it was presented to me not as a request, but as an update. My wife would mention it over dinner in the same casual tone she'd used to tell me about the weather. "Oh, they're adding the late-night station, isn't that fun?" And I would say something neutral and go to my office and move money around in my head. By the week of the wedding, I had written checks totaling $62,430. My daughter knew I was paying. She thanked me once, formally, in a text message that read, "Dad, we really appreciate everything you're doing for us. It means a lot." I saved that text. I don't know why. I still have it. My son-in-law, her fiancé, had said nothing to me directly about the money, not once. We'd had conversations about sports, about the house they were renting, about his plans at work. Not once had he looked me in the eye and acknowledged the thing I was doing for them. I told myself that was normal. Young men don't always know how to have those conversations. The Saturday of the wedding was a clear October evening. The lake caught the last of the sunlight and turned it orange. The venue did look exactly like the photographs. I'll give them that. I had spent 2 weeks preparing what I wanted to say at the reception. Nothing long. I'm not a long speech kind of man. Something honest. Something that said, I may not be her biological father, but I showed up, and I'm proud to see her happy, and I wish them well. I had written it down on a note card that was in the inside pocket of my jacket. The ceremony was brief and lovely. My wife cried again. Even I felt something loosen in my chest during the vows. I thought, maybe this is the moment. Maybe we come out the other side of tonight as something closer to a real family. At the reception, they seated me at table 7. Not the family table. Not beside my wife, who was at table 1 with the bride and groom. I was at table 7 with my wife's cousin from Cleveland, who I had met twice, and 2 couples whose connection to the evening I could never quite determine. I told myself it was a seating chart oversight. Then came the toasts. The maid of honor went first. She talked about my daughter's laugh, and her loyalty, and how she always showed up for the people she loved. Good toast. Deserved applause. My wife's mother went next. She talked about raising my wife, about watching my wife become a mother, about what it meant to see the family continue. Nice enough. Fine. Then my son-in-law's father stood up. He was a big man, easy in front of a crowd, the kind of person who's been giving speeches at club dinners for 30 years. He talked about his son's character, his integrity, his determination. Then he pivoted and his voice shifted into something lighter, and he gestured vaguely toward table 7. We all know who's really been bankrolling this shindig, he said. And people laughed a little, and I thought, okay, this is the acknowledgement moment. This is fine. The mysterious stepfather over at the back table. More laughter. Tell me, does he come with a venue package? The laughter that followed was not a little laughter. It was the whole room. It rolled through the dinner tables and bounced off those lakeside windows, and I sat there with $62,000 in my chest, and I watched my daughter cover her mouth and shake with it. My wife at table 1 laughed too. She looked at me a second later, maybe to gauge my reaction, and she stopped. But the moment had already happened. There's a particular feeling that comes when you realize, very clearly and very suddenly, that you have been seen as a function rather than a person. Not as a man who chose to stay, Not as someone who packed school lunches and sat in urgent care waiting rooms and wrote a check every single month for 14 years, just as a mechanism, the wallet that came with the wedding. I did not stand up. I did not leave. I folded my hands on the table, and I breathed and I waited. About 3 minutes later, a young man on the other side of the room stood up without being invited to do so. He was my son-in-law's college roommate. I had met him once at an engagement party for about 4 minutes. He had a beard and a quiet, deliberate way of speaking, and when he stood up he waited until the room noticed him, which took a moment. "I know this isn't my turn," he said, "but I've been sitting here for 10 minutes thinking about something and I can't just let it go." He looked at my son-in-law. "I've known you for 12 years. I know the kind of man your dad raised you to be, and I think you know that what just happened wasn't a joke." He set his glass down. "That man at table 7, I did a little math tonight at dinner. He paid for this room. He paid for this food. He paid for that lighting that everyone's been complimenting all evening. He paid for the bar. He let that sit. The least he deserves is a seat at the family table." The room had gone very quiet. My son-in-law looked at the tablecloth. My daughter looked at my son-in-law. My wife was looking at me with an expression I didn't know how to read. No one said anything for what felt like a long time. Then my son-in-law stood up. And I thought, here it is, the acknowledgement. Better late than not at all. He said, "Marcus is right, that was inappropriate." He said it to the room, not to me. Not once did he look at table 7. "Let's move on." And they moved on. The band started up again. The cake was cut. People drifted to the dance floor. A server came by with coffee, and I accepted a cup, and I sat there and I made a decision. I am not a dramatic man. I have never in my life made a scene. I have never raised my voice in anger in a way I was ashamed of afterward. I believe, genuinely, that most problems are better solved quietly than loudly. But there are limits. I excused myself from table 7 and I walked to the hallway outside the main room, where it was quieter, and I took out my phone. I called the event coordinator, a woman named Stephanie, who had my number in her phone, because we had spoken 14 times over the past 8 months. She answered on the second ring. "This is the father of the bride," I said. That felt strange to say, but I said it. "I need to discuss the remaining payment schedule." "Of course," she said. "Is everything all right? I need to put a hold on the late-night snack service. Don't set it up." Pause. "The late-night service is contracted. I paid for it. I'm the one who signed the contract, and I'm the one who's asking you to hold it. Do you want me to come to the office right now, or can we handle this on the phone?" She handled it on the phone. Then I called the bar coordinator. The extended open bar package ran until midnight. We agreed the bar would close at 10:30. I offered to absorb the partial refund as a credit against future events because I wanted this to be smooth and I didn't want staff to lose their money. The bar coordinator was professional about it. Then I sat down on a bench in the hallway, and I looked at the lake through a side window, and I thought about what I actually wanted. I didn't want to humiliate anyone. That was never the point. I didn't want to ruin the evening, or make my daughter cry, or give anyone a story to tell for the next 30 years about the stepfather who lost his mind at the reception. I wanted, I think, to be done. To draw a line, not for them, but for myself, under the idea that I could keep absorbing this and be all right. When the late-night station didn't appear, people noticed. My daughter noticed first. She came to find me in the hallway around 9:30. She looked the way she had looked at 9 years old when something hadn't gone her way. It was disorienting to see that face on an adult woman in a wedding dress. "The snack station," she said. "I know," I said. "And the bar, I know." She looked at me for a long moment. I think she was deciding whether to be angry or to ask what had happened. She chose angry, which I understood. At 9, she always chose angry when she was actually scared. "Tonight was supposed to be perfect," she said. "It still can be," I said, "but I need you to understand something, and I need you to actually hear it, not just wait for me to finish talking." I kept my voice level. "I have loved you as a daughter for 14 years. I have never once asked you to love me back the same way. I have never held the money over your head or made you feel indebted, or told you what I've given you when we've argued. I did those things because I wanted to, and I would do most of them again. I paused. But there are things I won't do anymore, and one of them is sit at table 7 while my son-in-law's father uses me as a punchline in a room full of people who are here because of my checkbook. She was quiet for a long time. He was just joking, she finally said. You laughed, I said. She didn't have an answer for that. I went back inside eventually. The bar closed at 10:30 as arranged. The evening wound down the way evenings do. People hugged and collected their coats and complimented the venue on their way out, not knowing nor not saying what had shifted in the room around 9 o'clock. My wife and I drove home mostly in silence, not the angry kind. We'd had that silence before, and this wasn't it. This was the quiet of two people who both knew something needed to be said, and neither one was ready to say it at 11:30 on a highway in October. She reached over somewhere around the I-270 interchange and put her hand on my arm, and I let her, and we drove the rest of the way like that. What came after was slower and harder and more honest than anything that had happened at the venue. My wife and I spent 3 separate evenings in the following 2 weeks just talking. Not arguing, talking. She told me she hadn't laughed because she agreed with what was said. She laughed because she was startled and nervous, and it was the involuntary reaction she'd had since childhood when she was uncomfortable. I believe her. I also told her that it had mattered, regardless of the reason, and she understood that. She called her daughter. I don't know exactly what was said. I wasn't in the room, but my daughter called me 3 days later, and it was the longest conversation we'd had in years, maybe ever. She cried. Not the angry kind of crying. She told me she'd spent a long time telling herself that my involvement in her life was just circumstantial, that I was there because I was her mom's husband, and not because of any genuine investment in her. She said she thought keeping that story made it easier to not feel like she owed me anything. And then she said, "But that's not really fair to you, is it?" It isn't. But I told her I understood it. We're not at the end of this. I don't think families arrive at fixed, finished places. They're always in the middle of something. My son-in-law sent me a message about a week after the wedding that was short and stiff and clearly hard to write, and that meant something. My daughter and I have had 2 more phone calls since. They're easier than the first one. My wife and I are still together. Still figuring out which parts of this were hers to carry and which parts were mine and which parts just belonged to a situation that nobody quite set up right from the beginning. Last Thursday, I drove past a commercial building off Henderson Road that I helped put up in 2009. The facade is still clean. The bones are good. I know, because I put them there. There's something to be said for building things that last. You don't always get to see what they become, but you can drive past them decades later and know they're still standing, and that you were the one who decided to stay and do the work, even when nobody was watching. That's enough. Most days, that's enough. I've thought about that October evening more times than I expected to, not with bitterness mostly, more with the slow, settling kind of clarity that only comes after the heat of something has passed. What happened at that lakeside venue didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of years of small choices, mine included. Every time I wrote a check without a conversation. Every time I told myself that bringing it up would make me look small. Every time I swallowed something that deserved to be said out loud. I'm not a victim of what happened that night. I'm partly the architect of it, and that took me a while to admit to myself honestly. There's a version of this story where I carry it as a grievance forever, where I tell it at dinner tables to make people feel sorry for me, and I let it calcify into the thing that defines how I see my wife, my daughter, that whole side of my life. I've seen men do that. I've watched good men turn one bad evening into a life sentence of resentment, and the only person it ever really imprisons is them. I chose differently. Not because I'm noble, because I've lived long enough to know that holding on to contempt for people you love is like keeping a stone in your shoe. You eventually stop noticing the pain. But you walk wrong for years. What I keep coming back to is Marcus, a young man I had met once for 4 minutes at an engagement party. He had no obligation to stand up in that room. Nobody asked him to. He just looked at a situation that was wrong, and decided that staying quiet made him part of it. That's not a small thing. That's actually a very hard thing to do in a room full of people who've already laughed and moved on. It requires a kind of moral clarity that I think a lot of us lose somewhere between 20 and 50, the ability to call something wrong without waiting for permission or consensus. I think about what it takes to be that kind of person, not just having the right instincts, but having thought carefully enough about what you value that you act on those instincts, even when it costs you something socially. That's not impulse. That's the result of someone who has genuinely worked on themselves. And then there's the question of endurance, of what it means to stay. Not in the passive, doormat way, but in the deliberate way that a craftsman stays with a difficult piece of work because he believes something real can come out of it. I built things with my hands for 40 years. I know the difference between a wall that's load-bearing and one that's just decorative. The relationships worth keeping are load-bearing. They hold something up. They deserve the effort of real repair, not just a coat of paint over the cracks. My daughter and I are still talking. My wife and I are still working through things with more honesty than we managed for a long time. None of it is finished, but I'm not sure finished is the right goal. Maybe the right goal is just to keep building, carefully, with good materials, and with enough self-respect to know when a foundation needs to be reset before you keep going up. I drove past that Henderson Road building again last week. Still standing. Still solid. That's what I'm after.